All right, good evening. Welcome to St. Joseph Parish. My name is Sherry Hansen. I'm the pastoral associate here, and I'm just really excited that you have joined us. And welcome to those who are joining us online. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to review what's going to happen tonight. So Professor Barrington will give a presentation for about 15 minutes on Russia and the Ukraine. And then following that, he will have a question and answer period. During that time, I will walk around with the microphone so that everybody at home and here can hear you. So if you would just raise your hand or stand up during that time so that I can approach you and put the microphone in front of you before you answer your question. We will have the question and answer period until about 7:30. At that time, I will call an end to the questions and we'll end with a prayer for peace. But Professor Barrington has volunteered to stay afterwards if you have any individual questions or additional questions after that. For those who are at home, if you have questions, you can email me or text me. You can get the information from our website, and I can ask the questions of Professor Barrington during the question and answer period. So it's my honor to introduce Professor Lowell Barrington, who is a parishioner here. I said this was good timing. We were just talking. This was Time and Talent Weekend we just passed, and he is giving up his time and talent to share with us what is going on with Russia and Ukraine. So we are really pleased that he is sharing his talents with us. Lowell Barrington is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Marquette University, and a research affiliate with UW-Madison's Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. His teaching and research specializations include post-communist politics, regional divisions and political attitudes in Ukraine, ethnicity and nationalism, democratization, and political science research methods. Professor Barrington's publications include Comparative Politics, Structures and Choices, currently being revised for a third edition to be published by Cambridge University Press. He has also edited a book with University of Michigan Press titled After Independence, Making and Protecting the Nation in Post-Colonial and Post-Communist States. His research articles have appeared in a variety of political science journals and scholarly journals focusing on East Central Europe and Eurasia. They include 3 articles specifically on Ukraine over the past year, published in Eurasian Geography and Economics, Europe-Asia Studies, and Post-Soviet Affairs. He is also the author of book chapters on identity, citizenship, and nationalism in both the Baltic states and Ukraine. Other than the 5 years in Ann Arbor, where he received his master's and PhD from the University of Michigan, Professor Barrington is a lifelong Wisconsinite and, as I said, luckily for us, a parishioner of St. Joseph Parish. Let us now welcome Professor Barrington. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. That was great. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is a really important topic right now, obviously, for the world, for Ukraine specifically, but I think increasingly for us in the United States, there's a lot of questions and a lot of concern about just what we can do, and a second concern about trying to just understand what's happened. And so what I want to do at the start, and I'm going to try to keep this brief, I was joking with Sherry before, and Father Steve can tell you, professors love to talk, and so I will do my best to keep it as short as I can. But I want to just talk a little bit about things that would be good for you to have in mind as we move to question and answer time about Russia and about Ukraine, and building on the Russia part in particular to a question that is probably the most common one that I get these days, which is what was Putin thinking? What was going into this decision? And it just seems like such a terrible decision, such a horrible outcome right now for everyone. You know, what was he thinking? So what I want to do is start by just thinking a little bit about Russia. And one of the things about Russia to know is Russia is huge. By the way, the photo, I have seen this particular image 30 times. It was the first time today as I was looking at this that I realized that he's looking right across the map to the far side where Ukraine is, on the far left side of the map. So that was very interesting. This is a years old picture of him looking at a map of Russia. Russia is the largest country in the world. It spans 11 time zones. It goes almost halfway around the world. It is a massive country. And one of the things about that is it has been prone in its history to invasions. So one of the things that we have to think about is, even relatively in historical terms, recent invasions like Napoleon's invasion, but also World War II, invasions coming from the West. And I think that that's something we need to keep in mind as we think about what he thinks about from something like NATO expansion, for example. And I just want to say something really briefly about World War II. World War II was a terrible event for the world, for Europe, for us. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II. It was the defining event in Soviet history in terms of just thinking about the struggle that people put into keeping themselves together as a society and keeping the country together. And it's something that, again, is still something that people look back to and think about those kinds of sacrifices. One of the other things is that we need to know that Russia is an authoritarian government, but had a brief period of democracy in the 1990s. The picture, it's a kind of a small photo there for you, but it's a picture of Boris Yeltsin standing on a tank giving a speech during the coup against Gorbachev and him at the very end of the Soviet period. And then Yeltsin became that president in the 1990s when the Soviet Union broke apart. But Vladimir Putin has been running the country as president, or a brief stint as prime minister where he also was running the country, since 2000. In other words, he is heading toward, by the end of this recent term that he's in, with the chance for an extension of that term farther into the future, being the leader of Russia for the first quarter century of the 21st century. I mean, he is the fixture in politics in a way that we don't usually see even these kinds of autocratic leaders stay in power for that long. There's the picture of him. I didn't get the picture of him riding the horse. That's the one everyone expects, but this is the one with him sort of shooting this rifle in the woods. And I put that picture on because one of the things about him too is he and people around him have worked very hard to cultivate an image about him as this strong man, tough leader, the person who can solve problems. And he's, again, kind of carefully crafted that, even though that was not necessarily his nature or reputation earlier as he was going through the ranks of the Soviet government, for example, through the KGB and things like that. One of the things about Russia, as you know, is there have been attacks on political opponents, attacks on journalists. The photo on the bottom there is Boris Nemtsov, who was a main opponent of Putin, who was assassinated right on the edge of Red Square in the middle of the evening. And just the kind of thing that has gone on in Russia that we now see taking just additional sort of emphasis on this from the Russian government about cracking down on opposition, cracking down on information. And so one of the things I'll talk about is that one of the other things we need to think about is, in terms of what Putin's thinking, it has to go back to not just the Soviet period and things like World War II. It goes back to the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed, and this was just a defining period of time for him as he thought about Russia. He would hang out in a cottage on a lake near St. Petersburg with friends of his from St. Petersburg, and they would talk about two things: how horrible Boris Yeltsin was as a president and how he was destroying Russia, and how even more the West was intentionally working to destroy Russia and weaken it. And this is something that he believed, and it's something that then, as he saw different things going on within the 90s, came to think of even more forcefully. That picture, which again is a little small for you in here, but is a picture of what was the Russian Parliament building at this point in 1993. If it looks like it's on fire to you, it is. Boris Yeltsin ordered troops to actually fire on the Parliament building because the people in the Parliament had locked themselves into the building to stop him from doing different things as president. So we had this political chaos. We had significant economic chaos in the 90s and deep declines, for example, in gross domestic product. So that graph, the first part of the graph above where it says the Yeltsin years, you'll see all the bars pretty much are going down. And that represents decline in the gross domestic product of the country. In other words, the decline in the size of the Russian economy. That first year on the far left, 1992, that decline was almost 15%. And that had been preceded by a terrible year in 1991, about as bad as that. And then you have a couple of years after that where, again, you see double-digit gross domestic product declines. About 40 to 50% of the Russian economy disappeared in a few years. in the early post-Soviet period as Yeltsin is taking over as president. And then you'll see that thing where all the bars start looking like they're going up instead of down. That marks when Putin came into power. So if you're trying to think, for example, why was this person so popular, one of those answers is a basic economic one. The 1990s were terrible. Putin's period was much better after that. There was also significant social challenges, poverty, severe inequality, and things that again, Russians had not seen during the Soviet period in the same way. The other thing I want to just mention is about the conflict in Chechnya, which is just symbolic of the problems in the 1990s and what was really thought of as a sort of sign of an ultimate example of weakness of Russia at this point in time. So Chechnya is that little sort of orangish part of Russia there in between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. It borders Georgia, the independent country of Georgia, near Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it started pushing for independence and was there was an effort made by the Russian government to attack that region of its own country and get control of it to stop this move toward independence. And that goes terribly badly for the Russian military. So I have on the slide there, it says the New Hampshire anecdote. You're all thinking, what does New Hampshire have to do with this? So it's a just 1 minute sort of aside here about imagine, if you would, that we lost the Cold War and the United States broke apart. The northern and eastern part of the United States stayed together as the biggest remaining piece, but there were 14 other pieces of the United States that became independent countries, but there's this one big piece, and so that's kind of called the United States still. And New Hampshire is part of that, and New Hampshire declares independence from this new piece of territory of the United States that's only part of what it used to be. And the United States government thinks, well, that's cute, it's New Hampshire, it's not really a problem, until they start whipping up separatists in Vermont, and they start blowing up oil pipelines, and they start doing things like this. And so the US government, the President of the United States, at that point says, enough, sends in the United States military to get control of New Hampshire, and we lose. That's what happened in Chechnya. They sent in the Russian military to get control of this little region of the country, and they lost. And they had to settle a peace deal with the Chechens that lasted then from 1996 until 1999, when, with Putin's guidance, they went back in late 1999, got control of Chechnya, but in horribly ruthless fashion. And as we think about bombing today in Ukraine, we want to think about other instances of this, including how Grozny was attacked by the Russians when they went back in Chechnya. So again, a much more severe attack the second time, and again, with, as we've seen more recently, again, not significant regard for civilians and the distinction between civilian and military targets. Just entire neighborhoods were leveled in the bombing. The other really important thing about what we need to know about Russia is Putin is not Russia. Putin is Putin. I talk about this as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's really the Russian military's invasion of Ukraine ordered by Putin. Russia itself, in terms of the Russian people, are not only not all in favor of this, most of them don't know what's going on right now in the country. They don't have good information. People in the big cities and younger people still have some access. It's been harder, but some access to social media and the internet and things like that, so they can see what's going on. In the small towns and the rural areas of the country and among the older population, they are convinced that this is a small little incursion by the Russian military into the far east of Ukraine, and that's all that's happening, and that they have no idea why the West is doing anything to Russia right now. It makes no sense to them, because that's all they're hearing from the state media, and the independent media have been shut down at this point. So the other thing is that in addition to Putin not being Russia, he's not the Russian soldiers. The Russian military is doing a lot of terrible things right now, but again, we also have to be careful about the distinction of assuming all the Russian soldiers want this to happen and even want to be in Ukraine. Many of them were told they were going on a training mission into Ukraine. They were not told this was going to be a live shooting war. So again, just have in mind when you see the stories of some of these Russian soldiers, and it's not a huge number, but people surrendering or just giving up and going, even occasionally some reports of them actually fighting on the Ukrainian side. Part of that is, again, they did not know what this was. They weren't even given the information as they were going into the country about what this was about. And there's a sort of famous photo at the bottom of the slide there, which is, you probably heard the story, it's a woman in a city north of Crimea where the Russians were one of the early spots they had gone into, and she confronts a Russian soldier who's got his weapon in hand. and walks up to him and first of all chews him out, asks him why they're here, what are you doing? And then offers him a handful of sunflower seeds and asks them to put it in his pocket, which he did not do, by the way, but she says, I want you to take these sunflower seeds and put these in your pocket so that when you die and fall on the ground in this war, that you can fertilize these flowers that are going to grow in your place. And so if you've seen the sunflower as a symbol related to this conflict, this is the story that triggered that. And it's just again, this is a horrible situation that I don't want to romanticize in any real way, but these are the kinds of things that ordinary Ukrainians are doing. They are going to confront soldiers. They're going to do it non-violently, and they're going to do it violently. And that's one of the things, again, as we think about how this will go down the road, we just need to think about that. So real quickly, on this question of sort of what was Putin thinking, first of all, he is portrayed in the West a lot of times as this strategic genius. He plays three-dimensional chess, we play checkers, all that. That's not terribly accurate. He actually is often very focused on the immediate tactics of something and misses big picture things. He also really did not understand what was going on in Ukraine, about attitudes that had changed in Ukraine, and really had no sense that there would be a significant resistance. But on top of that, even as he thought rationally, he didn't have reason to think, first of all, that sanctions were going to be as hard as they were. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 and very little happened. They took Crimea and whipped up support for separatists in far eastern Ukraine and gave them military support in 2014, and nothing really happened. And they were part of the effort in Syria to keep Assad in power and engaged in a massive bombing campaign in Aleppo that killed thousands of people, again, without discriminating between civilians and military, and really didn't face any cost for that either. So even as we're thinking about, the kind of what is he thinking from a strategic standpoint, I don't think he saw coming the sanctions and the unity of the West. The other thing that he has, though, is also this kind of true believer side to him. And that means that he sees a few things as something that he deeply believes is true and right. And one of those things is this idea that, again, the Ukrainians and the Russians, and he believes this to some degree, are the same people. They're one large people. Ukrainians maybe have sort of gone off separately from Russians a bit, but they still are one large Slavic people, and therefore there would not be opposition to this action in Ukraine. He also thought that, and deeply believes, that the West, Europe in particular, and the US, harmed Russia significantly in the 1990s, and they were continuing to try to do that by expanding NATO. He believes deeply that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence around it, what I heard somebody really nicely call a sphere of control around its country, of other countries. He believes that they have a right to that, and he believes that NATO is a real security threat. So we can say, that's ridiculous, there's no way NATO was going to invade Ukraine. The point is, he believed NATO was a security threat. So all those things were kind of going together, and as a result of that, the strategic parts and the kind of true believer parts for him lead to what we talk about sometimes in political science as an overdetermined outcome. Everything was pointing to this as something that he would take seriously and ultimately do. All right, real quickly in terms of things about Ukraine, there is an image of Ukraine about the east of Ukraine and the west of Ukraine, with the Dnipro River serving as this sort of magic dividing line. That's never really been true. I do a lot of work on mass attitudes in Ukraine with my own research. In the far western part of the country, people were far more pro-European and anti-Russian than they were in the far eastern part of the country. That's true. But it's not this line in the middle. There's a kind of blurring across the country. And the point is, wherever that line had been, where people are either looking more toward Russia for how they would feel connecting, or pointing Ukrainian foreign relations in that direction versus Europe, after 2014, when Russia invaded and got Crimea, that line pushed eastward. The whole middle part of the country that might have thought, well, we could see a little bit of this looking east or west, that all turned to a support for Europe. And even in the far eastern part of Ukraine, there were people opposed to Russian intervention in Ukraine in 2014 and even now. And I just want to give one very quick example, not a huge number of people that we can point to, but there were ethnic Russian residents of Ukraine in the east of Ukraine fighting Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine in 2014. So there was opposition to this 8 years ago. The new invasion has shattered any kind of connection between Ukrainians and some sense of attachment to Russia. The cities that have been attacked to date are some of the more Russian-speaking and even ethnic Russian cities in Ukraine. And so even those ethnic Russians that maybe had been thinking, I still have this kind of attachment to Russia, right now they have no sense of understanding of what is going on and why this is happening and why Russia is doing this. And so even if somehow Russia is able to get control of this country, you are looking at a decade of just a horrible insurgency effort, and horribly in the sense of a violent insurgency, and guerrilla warfare and things that Ukrainians will engage in to make life hell for whatever government that is, whether it's a occupying force or a kind of puppet government that the Russians try to set up. And so again, we have these different things that have happened in terms of attitudes in the country. After 2014, Ukraine became more Ukrainian. More people were speaking Ukrainian. If they had spoke both languages before, they were leaning more toward Ukrainian after 2014. If they spoke Russian only, they started speaking Ukrainian more after 2014. And again, these are all things, I sort of joke about it, that what Putin really needed to have done is to read social science research on Ukraine, because he would have seen this stuff going on and realized they were not going to be welcomed. But again, the problem was he believed it, and so we have this horrible situation because there's a part of him that really thought they were going to be welcomed with open arms as essentially kind of liberators against the West or something like that, right, in his mind. All right, so that was a long time for me to do some introduction there, so sorry about that. I do want to take questions, and Sherry's also going to be able to come around with a microphone, so if you have questions, we'll spend the rest of the time on that. Have the prayer session at the end, and then I will be again around if you have one-on-one questions you want to ask as well later on. That would be great as well. So any questions, you can just raise a hand, and she will come around.
He said something to Sweden and Finland not to dare become part of NATO. Do you think his eyes are going that way?
So the question was about whether, because Putin has threatened Finland and Sweden, who are not NATO members but have been talking about it, whether he has intentions to sort of go up in that area and try to stop it from happening. I don't think so, for two reasons. One is he has his hands full in Ukraine right now. This has gone horribly badly for the Russian military. It's been an embarrassment for the Russian military. Again, partly their fault in terms of logistics. Largely, a lot of it was just how effective the Ukrainians had been, and they were not expecting that. The second thing is, part of the story of him going into Ukraine, really to NATO, was about creating conflict. And so this would be the argument for your question in terms of a possibility. If he were to inject a little bit of the Russian military across the borders in Finland, Sweden, spark a conflict, that would make NATO less likely to take those countries in because they're unstable and things, right? So that would be the argument for it. I don't think he's going to do that. I don't think he has time to do it right now. And I don't know, I'm about 50% on predictions so far with this entire situation with Ukraine. But I think by sometime late summer, early fall, both of those countries may be NATO members already at that point. I think they will push for it, and I think that NATO will be open to it. And again, on the long list of things that Putin just has done, well, the long list of things that have happened that he did not want to happen, NATO was on the verge of collapse in 2020, partly our doing in the United States. This invasion has made NATO more obviously relevant to people in Europe and in the United States than anything else that could have been done. And so again, he has created this kind of unity and this ability for Europeans and the US to work together on something that we just were not expecting. I think he wasn't expecting either before the invasion. So, other questions?
I didn't know if you could just talk a little bit about when Russia did collapse, these other countries that kind of came about. What sort of, I guess, agreement was put in place? Or are they autonomous, like Ukraine could just be Ukraine and Belarus and these other countries kind of be on their own? Or was there some other connection that we aren't aware of?
Good, so the question was about when the Soviet Union fell apart, what was the understanding between Russia and the other countries around it? And one of the things I'll say is the understanding of the other countries was not always the same understanding as Russia's. There was a term that Russians use called the near abroad, which is sort of saying these are foreign countries, but they're kind of a special category of foreign countries, right? They're the immediate bordering countries, so they're not really the abroad, they're the near abroad. Russia believed, even under Boris Yeltsin, believed that there was a sort of right to kind of keep order in that area, to be the major regional player, even build again toward being a great global power. But again, some of those countries, the three Baltic states, for example, moved very quickly away from any ties with Russia, ultimately later on joining the European Union and NATO. Others stayed pretty close to Russia for economic reasons. One of the initial problems for some of the countries that emerged when the Soviet Union collapsed was that the Soviet economy had been interconnecting all these areas, right? They all just were parts of the Soviet Union. So you may have a big factory in eastern Ukraine, but that requires parts that are made in a factory in Georgia. So there was all this kind of work that had to be done, or a lot of factories in Russia that were supplying things to these other countries. So they were somewhat reluctant to push for, kind of complete independence. But it's important that you brought this up, because this was precisely what was going on in 2008 in Georgia, which was it was openly talking about EU membership and openly talking about NATO membership. NATO did something that I don't think in hindsight was a very good idea. It basically told Georgia and Ukraine, we envision you being members, we just don't know when. Which is sort of the worst thing they could say, right? They said, we want you, but we don't know what the timeline is, but you've now told Putin at that point, who's president in that period of time, that both of them are going to be NATO members at some point, but it'll be down the road sometime in a vague, timeline. So the point is, it's a little complicated. Some of them really pushed for separating from Russia, and the response in the case of Georgia was Russian forces invaded the northern part of Georgia. And that had even been going on earlier in Georgia. In the early 1990s, there was a civil war in Georgia that Russia sort of took sides on and caused problems for some of the Georgian forces and things at that point, even in the early 1990s as well. So depends a bit on the country, but in general, as you can imagine, a lot of these leaders in this region are pretty nervous about looking like they're trying to flee Russian influence too quickly, because the track record, other than the Baltic states, is that hasn't gone very well.
What role has orthodoxy played in this whole thing? I know that the Patriarch has even supported the war, and yet in Ukraine, the Orthodox Church there is clearly in opposition to it. So it seems like there's tension within Orthodoxy, and I'm guessing that the Russian government is at least using people's alignment with Orthodoxy in some way to support this and to say this is a God-given mission or whatever might be.
Right. So this question about Orthodox Christianity in the region is a really important one. I will point out, first of all, something about Ukraine, which is interesting, which is that there is a Russian Orthodox Church that operates in Ukraine. There's a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, obviously, but there's also in the far western part of the country a Uniate Catholic group where they actually officially are Catholics. They recognize the authority of the Pope, but they are allowed to practice Eastern Orthodox rites and rituals. The Vatican has let them do that. It's a really interesting group. But most of the residents of Ukraine, most of the residents of Russia, to the extent that they're believers, are Orthodox. This split between the Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox Church was building long before this invasion. It's been a sort of source of tension within the Orthodox faith in this part of the world. You are right that Patriarch Kirill has been very supportive of Vladimir Putin. Pope Francis, I believe, and he had a conversation today, if I heard in the news correctly. I don't know how that went, but I think that the Pope was trying to just say, how can we stop this? And the problem is I don't think the Orthodox Church is interested in that right now. Vladimir Putin is really good at using people. He expects loyalty. He doesn't always give it back. So one of the things about the Orthodox Church is if it would help Putin's cause to turn on the Orthodox Church, he would throw the Orthodox Church under the bus in a heartbeat and not care about it at all. But it has been hugely helpful for him, and the Orthodox Church has benefited because one of the things the Russian government has done is make life very difficult for other religions, other Christian religions, denominations, for example, to practice in Russia, and has put in place a variety of policies that the Orthodox Church has really wanted them to do and things like that. So the church has benefited in that way, but it's come at, again, really a terrible price of public support for this conflict. I mean, even as the invasion was happening, the official statement out of the church was that, there are these dark forces aligned against Russia and we need to support this effort. I mean, that was what they were saying. So again, the divide between the Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox Church is deep, but unfortunately, I think the church in Russia itself, where you would hope it would be the source of kind of quiet opposition or not so quiet opposition to the war, in fact, has largely been supportive of it.
So right now, the people have a common enemy in Putin and the military and the like. And the culture of Ukraine is a mixed one, both orthodoxy and non. Going forward, assuming, and praying for an end to the battles, and through your studies, what might be some of the common bonds that existed and some of the common bonds or the bonds that need to be created to unify that country to rebuild? We're a community of practicing Catholics here at St. Joseph's Parish. This is our base, this is our unity. The people are going to be fractured, hurt. You can have a building campaign, you can have a this and a that, but we're talking about an entire country.
So this question about, and I assume you're asking about Ukraine specifically. So the idea of how Ukraine unifies after this and rebuilds is a difficult one. I will say on the unity front, again, on the long list of things that Putin did not, I think, anticipate, the Ukrainian population is more united right now than it has ever been in the certainly post-Soviet period. Again, for horrible reasons and because of horrible losses that they're suffering. But what we are seeing, what we had been seeing even after 2014 up to now, was already this move where there was greater unification. There had never been a really strong commitment to a kind of overarching civic national identity in Ukraine early on. There were ethnic divides. They were complemented to a certain extent by different regional divides, different languages spoken. But even those sub-national identity groups, it was never clean-cut. A lot of Ukrainians spoke Russian, so the line wasn't so sharp between ethnic groups about language. And then again, one of the things we started seeing after 2014 was we started to see these things come together. There's a much stronger sense of attachment. My own research asks questions in surveys about attachment to an overarching citizenship-based civic identity. And there are a lot of people who said that that's a very important part of their identity, and that was before this latest invasion. This was partly as a result of things in 2014. So the unity part, I'm fairly confident that it can be addressed. There will be, you will need significant leadership by the Ukrainian government to ask people not to go after people who maybe looked like they might have been supporting the Russian effort or something. That's always a danger in the post-conflict situation. But I think in general, the country itself will be unified pretty well. The rebuilding process is going to take a long time and a lot of money that Ukraine will not have. So we will need some kind of Marshall Plan-like effort to send, and again, the Biden administration has been very effective, I think, so far in the strategy it's taken from even before the invasion in all this intelligence they were leaking out and declassifying, saying this is what Russia's doing, this is what they're going to do, everybody needs to be ready for this. And they were criticized for doing that in a lot of ways, but they actually caused some problems for Putin by doing that and calling him out in advance of things. The other piece of that, though, is now there's this question of sort of what else can we do? And I would have liked, ideally, in the State of the Union, for President Biden to say, start setting aside money, send money to charities that are helping Ukraine, and then start setting aside money. Because gas is going to go up, and it's going to be $6 a gallon or something, right? Now it's kind of plateaued, and it looks like maybe it's not going to get there right now. But the next steps of what Russia is about to do are going to require additional sanctions. And we are running out of the sanctions that we have at our disposal at this point. There's more we can do. We can talk about that more in Q&A here if you want after this response. But one of the things that's going to have to happen is we have to target their energy resources. We have to target the revenue they get from those energy sales. We've done that, but frankly, our stepping in on that about not buying Russian oil is pretty minor, that we didn't get much oil from Russia. It's about 5% of our imports of oil come from Russia, and most of that went to California and Hawaii. And the Hawaii main refinery in Hawaii had already announced before our government did they were not going to take Russian oil anymore. So in a way, that was symbolic, and it's important as a symbol. What really has to happen is Western Europe has to step up, and Germany in particular has to step up. And that's where we're also going to have to devote money as an American government. We're going to have to support the German people if they actually cut off Russian energy sales to Germany. They get about 40% of their energy from Russia. So it would be a massive sacrifice for them to do that. As a result of that, most people have said it can't happen. I think it's very well could happen. There's everything that we have said so far about, well, that's not going to work. Europe and the U.S. will never come together on that. We've seen it happen, one after another after another. So I actually think that could happen, but it's going to take sacrifice on our part too, and then sacrifice down the road in supporting aid to other countries. We spend a very small portion of our gross domestic product on foreign aid compared to a lot of other countries in the world. Ukraine is going to need a lot of assistance, and it's not going to be in millions of dollars, and not even probably in billions of dollars. It will be in tens of maybe even 100 billion or more minimum from us alone to rebuild the country if we want to get it back to even anything close to where it had been. I saw there's a hand over here before. Yeah.
I don't know if my question is related to political science, but you mentioned a little bit what has driven and what is driving Putin ideologically and historically to these actions. And I'm wondering at this point, given the resistance that he's faced in the Ukraine and the relatively limited success that he's had, at this point, what role would his ego come into this, given how the world is looking at him at this point? And in that light, what is he capable? What of saving face? What is he capable and willing to do in order to save?
Right. So there are a couple of questions kind of packed together in there, and I want to separate them out. But let me start with the ego question. All politicians, all political leaders have egos. That's part of how they get to the place that they're at. But an autocrat has a particular kind of ego, and a particular kind of, the kind of part two of your question is, over time, one of the things that happens in what is referred to as a personalist autocracy, the autocracy but around the personality of the leader, is the circle of people that leader trusts over time shrinks. And we're watching this with Putin. He is getting more and more paranoid about people around him. The very odd photos that we've all seen of him sitting 40 feet on the other end of a table from someone, there are lots of rumors about that he's ill. There are lots of thoughts that he may have problems or concerns with COVID because of something he's being treated for. There are also concerns he may have that somebody may just sort of jump and try to tackle him, and who knows? I mean, like he's doing this in a way that would be consistent with a lot of things we see with these kinds of leaders over time. They start to get a little more paranoid of people around them, they tighten that circle, and as a result, they get really bad information. So one of the things that could have happened here with this invasion is he tells his advisors, I think this is going to go great. I think we're going to have control of Kiev in 2 days. And all the military advisors are looking at him going, sure, yes, right? Even though they don't believe it because they're afraid to criticize him and what might happen to them. And so all of that is to say, I don't think he's crazy in the way that people talk about, but I think he is frazzled. I think he feels cornered. I think he feels embarrassed. I think he feels humiliated. To the extent that he knows his own history, one of my students just wrote this on a midterm exam, I was so happy, the other day, that one of the things Putin ought to be understanding right now is his own country's history, that when regimes fall, it happens because of losses in war and economic problems. And those two are coming together for him at the same time really badly right now. So the scary thing about that is it means all these things come together. The ego, he doesn't back down, it's not in his personality, right? All those things about his personality, his understanding of history means there's not an easy off-ramp for him here. He will, even where I think we could have found some traction before the actual invasion on this idea of Ukraine kind of being a non-aligned country, sort of what doesn't join NATO, and it's got this permanent status in that way where it's not going to take sides. That right now for him is not a win. So his only win is overthrowing the Ukrainian government and trying to get control of the country. And the problem is that will be a very short-lived win, because then you have to govern that country. And If you want to occupy it, I have seen estimates all over the place. I personally have sort of settled down on the idea that they would probably need to permanently, or at least for some long period of time, have about 500,000 troops in Ukraine to occupy the country. They don't have 500,000 troops to do that with. They can't. They could build that kind of army, but it's not going to be trained. It's not going to work very well. The other option is they put in place this kind of puppet government, right? But that government also has to deal with security, and it's going to deal with these kinds of problems. So he may get a very narrow, shallow victory. Zelensky may be killed at some point. There's different things that could happen, and they may get control of Kiev. It is not going to come in days, by the way, when they actually move into Kiev. I don't know how many of you have seen pictures of Kiev. They aren't showing a ton of pictures from Kiev right now. It looks like a massive 3 million person bunker. Everything is sandbagged. Everything, like, they are digging in, and they are ready to fight on the streets. So the other part of the answer to your question then is, unfortunately, it means they're going to continue to take losses on the ground going in, which means they turn even more to bombing. And we've seen most of the things that we've seen that have been horrible, and I don't want to minimize them, have been artillery shells or small rockets and missiles. They have not been flying over the bombers with bombers and just dropping carpet bombing bombs. They did it a little bit in one spot once so far, but I mean, they have not been doing that in the way they could. And so that's the scariest part to your answer is he won't back down. He knows the war is going badly. He knows that's threatening to him. And so he just starts leveling cities. The last piece of that question is there a point at which somebody steps in to try to remove him? And I think we're sort of hopeful that that might be the case. One, I would urge you to be careful about being too hopeful about that because we don't know who we're going to get after that. It probably would be better, but I can't guarantee it's going to be somebody actually better than Putin if that happens. The second thing is, again, it's hard to imagine that being pulled off in the short run because how do you have that conversation with other people in the inner circle or even the outer parts of the inner circle, right? Do you say, imagine if Putin weren't in charge and you look for their reaction and hope they look like they might agree with you or something? I mean, it's really hard to overthrow a leader internally like that. And so it's really going to have to come down to the military is probably the most likely way that this could happen. They start disobeying orders, and the military just turns on him or something. But again, the problem is there are no routes right now out of this that look terribly positive. There's little glimmers of hope about the negotiations where both sides seem to say something that looks like it's opened a door, but the Russian track record so far in the talks has not been that they're taking them seriously. So hope that can happen. Pray for those talks to work. I don't expect it in the near term. Other questions? Yes, please. Let's get the microphone over there.
President Zelensky has been begging the United States to help him with the airspace, and we've not been doing that because we're afraid it'll spark World War III. How true is that?
So the question about the no-fly zone and finding ways to sort of protect Ukraine from the attacks from the skies is a really important one. I am in agreement that we cannot do a no-fly zone in Ukraine. There may be other things we might be able to help with about certain routes for humanitarian purposes, things like that, maybe. But a no-fly zone means we are preventing Russian aircraft from flying. To do that, we need to be ready to shoot them down. That will likely mean our own pilots are up in the air engaging them. And it also means if our pilots go up, we have to fire into Russia for their air defenses so our planes are not all shot down. In other words, it means we are deciding we are engaging Russia in war. That's what a no-fly zone means in practice. Now, could we do more than we've been doing in terms of other kinds of defensive weapons? Yes. I don't know how effective some of the older Soviet aircraft from Poland, that idea, it maybe can't hurt. Although that piece is an interesting one because Poland's request for that came with the understanding, two understandings. One is it was going to send those planes to Germany and NATO pilots were going to fly them from Germany into Ukraine. which we said absolutely not, and the rest of NATO said absolutely not, because that means we are flying attack aircraft into Ukraine. But the second thing about that is first of all, the other piece of the Poland story is they were expecting brand new fighter jets from us and to replace their old Soviet ones. So that would have been a lot of money we're spending again on the Polish military in that way. The other piece of this is those planes have to sit somewhere. There are other effective things we could be doing. We could be increasing, for example, if we wanted to supply them with more weapons, we could increase the number of drones that they're using. They have a few, they're very effective so far. Nobody quite understands why the Russians can't shoot them down. The drones they have are really old and slow, and they sort of just hang there in the sky, and they haven't been shot down very much. But those have been working. And then other kinds of anti-missile technology things we have, those are expensive things, and they're very complicated. We have to have training for the people that are going to use them. It's not a next day thing we can do. But those are things we can do. In the meantime, what we are going to do is what we just announced, the president just announced today, which is another $800 million of aid that's going to include a lot of Javelin and Stinger shoulder-held rocket launcher, both air attack and tank attack weapons. And those have been very effective as well so far. But so, I mean, again, we can do those things. I get the idea that we're sort of allowing Putin to set the terms. But one of the problems that the world has gotten itself into over decades and decades of how this has all played out is when you have nuclear weapons, you get to do things that countries that don't have nuclear weapons can't do, because the risk of that kind of conflict is so different from just a conventional war risk. This is one of the things Ukraine is so frustrated about, and it goes back to that earlier question about kind of what were the understandings after the Soviet Union broke up. One of the other understandings from Ukraine, when it gave up its significant number of nuclear missiles from the Soviet period that had been stationed in Ukraine, is that it would be protected and not be attacked and not taken over by another country. So they see the West as in fact kind of going against that. They also see Russia going against that, because Russia had accepted that idea also. But if Ukraine had maintained those nuclear weapons, which again, we can be happy they didn't, because there was all sorts of chaos in Ukrainian politics over the years where maybe it would have not been great for them to have nuclear weapons. But if they had had them, Putin probably would not have invaded. And that's the world we're in right now, where nuclear weapons just changed the calculation. In the same way, that's why I am hopeful that it is nowhere in his mind to have a single Russian soldier step 1 foot into a NATO member country, whether that's Poland or Estonia or any of those countries. Because if he does that, he's attacked the United States. That's NATO, that's the deal, that's the understanding. So because we have nuclear weapons, I'm hoping there is some part of him that says that kind of exchange is not worth anything that we're trying to do. I'm a little less optimistic, though still fairly optimistic, they will not use the tactical, the battlefield nuclear weapons, the sort of smaller ones that they also have. Because I think the response from the West would be, that would be the thing, for example, Germany cuts off all energy tomorrow if they do that. I mean, that's the kind of thing where the economic hit for Russia of doing that is incredible. So I'm hoping he's rational enough at this point that that isn't given as an order. I also never thought I would see shelling of a nuclear power plant by a military. That was crazy. That was, there are a lot of fail-safes in even those nuclear power plants in that part of the world, but if you cut off the electrical with that bombing and you happen to disable the backup generators, that plant melts down. I mean, it would have been worse than Chernobyl in that area. I mean, that was when I saw that, the first reaction I had is, that's crazy. Somebody's given that order and people are following that order. And so that's the moment where I went from 0% they would ever use tactical battlefield nuclear weapons to like 5% because I just saw that. Right? But I still don't think it's likely. The nuclear weapons thing is such a different game. But that's also why we can't do the no-fly zone. The benefits of the no-fly zone, and they would be significant, although again, also remind yourself too that again, the bulk of the damage so far has not been with bombers from on high. It's been things that I'm not sure would get caught through a no-fly zone. So there are other things we could do other than that.
What would you consider Putin's religious affiliation? Would you call him a Christian, atheist, ex-communist?
So the question is about what I think Putin's religious affiliation is. He is a stated Russian Orthodox Christian. I believe there is a little bit of that in him, but I think it's the piece of the Orthodox Church that he likes in terms of the tradition and the pomp and the czar as link between God and ordinary people in the old days of the Tsarist Empire with the Orthodox Church. So the answer is I don't honestly know what's in his heart. I don't know that we can know that, other than I know right now that there doesn't seem to be a lot of one there at times. But I would say that, again, my sense with him is this is a largely strategic alliance with the Orthodox Church to help keep him in power. And if he thought it would help to break that alliance with the Orthodox Church, he would do that. He'd shut down all the churches in the country if he needed to. And the church is playing a very dangerous game in kind of getting this close to him. Besides just the, morally questionable side of it, just for their own well-being, keeping some greater distance would have probably been a good idea.
I have two questions back to the airspace. President Zelensky and the people they stop on the street, they are all stuck on the airspace. Do you think the people think that planes are dropping bombs on them, and that's why they think they have to have the airspace? They're doing great on the ground. They need weapons. If there were more planes, I'm just a little confused as to why they're so obsessed with that. And the second question is, and I know you can't tell, but do you think they'll resort to chemical weapons?
So let me take the second part of that first. Again, I am less than 50-50 on that, in the sense that I think it's less likely to happen than more likely to happen, but not by a lot, because one of the things that Russia does, traditionally in its history, it's done this. During the Soviet period, they did this. Putin has done this a lot. They build up a false story about something as a kind of effort to give an excuse for doing something that's essentially that same kind of thing. So the story, and by the way, the story has all sorts of really strange connections to websites and social media in the United States about how that story spread as well, about chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine. Them putting out that story, if you were thinking about using chemical weapons and you're Putin, you need that story out as cover. So that's why it's so concerning that they put this story out that has no, as far as I know, no basis in any kind of reality at all. So again, am I concerned about it? Yes, only because I think that there's a reason they were floating that story. And there could be lots of reasons, but that's one at least possible reason for that, was that it gives them a way of saying, first of all, what they would actually say initially is, we didn't do that, that was the Ukrainians. That's the other thing they do. Right? They say, we didn't bomb that hospital, the Ukrainians bombed their own hospital, which they've been saying. So when that doesn't work, then they might eventually get around to the idea of saying, okay, we did it, but we did it because they were about to use chemical weapons against our troops and we were responding, that kind of thing. So yes, I'm a little concerned about that, but I still think it's less likely than more likely to happen. You really hit a really interesting point. I think among the Ukrainian people, not so much Zelensky, but he made a mistake, I think, in thinking we would do a no-fly zone, and so he kept sticking with that message. And because of that, that's resonated with his people, and I think you're right. They may be confusing a rocket from 2 miles away from, a bomber, although there have been missiles now launched from aerial vehicles. I mean, it's not like that's not happened at all, but it's still not the majority of the damage so far. So you're right that so far, the bulk of the damage has not come from the things that a no-fly zone would necessarily even stop from happening. And that's the other piece of the no-fly zone is, if we put a no-fly zone in place, are we just saying Russian planes can't fly, and we're going to allow them to fire rockets and missiles? Because if we're letting them do that, then there's going to be a lot more people killed. If we're not letting them do that, it means we need to attack Russian positions. So again, the no-fly zone is a very tricky thing, and I think it was one of those things that we were very clear about from the start, that this is a non-starter for us. And the only way we get there is something that I just don't want to think about, because it's going to be something so horrific that the US and NATO decide we have no choice now. And that would be a really, really horrible event involving tens of thousands of people killed at the same time or more. That kind of thing might shake NATO and the US to do that. But again, the nuclear weapons thing is, it's the thing that allows Russia to do things that Kazakhstan couldn't do, or Egypt couldn't do, or different countries like that can't do things like that because they don't have that threat and that card to play. Because again, This is a terrible event. It's a very dangerous situation for European security. It's a very difficult and dangerous situation for world security. It's not a nuclear war yet. And that's, again, that's where I think the US has decided we need to, as much as we want to help, there are certain things we have to be a step back from to not risk that. There's actually somebody behind you, I think, first.
Can you speak? The media has suggested that Putin has been asking help from his friends in China. How far do you think that will go?
So the question is about how much is China helping or will continue to help Russia. The obligatory caveat at the beginning is I'm not a China specialist, so I will say that first. But that said, during the Olympics, China and Russia announced this sort of newer, deeper sense of connection between the two countries, supporting each other in foreign policy areas more. I still don't know that meant that China wanted Russia to do this. I think it's very interesting, maybe the word I'd use, that in the Security Council votes at the UN, when Russia vetoed resolutions, China just abstained. They didn't join Russia in vetoing it. And one of the reasons that I've been thinking about this as something that Xi, the president of China, can't want this to go the way it has is, first of all, if China is thinking about Taiwan down the road, which is the other piece of the story that people kind of link into this, right? He can't be happy with the way Europe and the US have come together on this conflict. I mean, that can't be a happy thing for him to see. But the other piece of this is that we are in, the invasion of Ukraine marked a bunch of things, and a friend of mine who works for, he's the president of a political think tank called Eurasia Group, and he said on the news the other day, the invasion of Ukraine marked the end of the post-Cold War period. Right? We're in the Cold War, the 90s through up to now, we were in this post-Cold War world, and we were kind of figuring out the rules, but we were still trying to figure them out. His point is we now are done with that. We are in something else. It's kind of taking shape, but it may be some other kind of Cold War. So if you're China, you may think, okay, well, now we have to align with Russia against the US and Europe if it's this new Cold War. Right? But if I were the president of China, I would not be happy if Russia has forced me into that position for a whole bunch of reasons. We are much more dependent on China economically than we are dependent on Russia economically. But China is also very dependent on Western European and American markets. We could do significant damage. It would be bad for our economy, but we could do significant damage to the Chinese economy. The other piece of the story is China has been doing really well for the last couple of decades. They had obviously a bad situation with COVID, as a lot of the world did. Their economy continued to grow, though, during most of the last 20 years in significant ways, huge growth rate. They have massively increased spending on the military relatively quietly. We have not been paying a lot of attention to that in the media in the United States, for example. Some of you are probably aware in the South China Sea, these different things, they've built these artificial reefs. They've just dumped stuff in the water, created this big reef, and then built landing strips on them so they could have access to different things to fly in planes into different parts of the South China Sea. They've been doing all these things in this post-Cold War period that we were in. Right? So why would they want to be pushed into this new thing where the US and Europe are now against them in an alliance with Russia? They can get one thing from Russia, and it's important, and that's energy. That's the only thing they can get from Russia. Russia doesn't offer them massive markets to sell their products, frankly, but they can get energy from Russia. That's the main thing that they need them for. And that's something. But again, I don't think that they are going to support Russia as closely as we, and unilaterally just say, yes, we're going to support you no matter what. This is a blanket statement, and just take the Russian side on this. And I'll tell you, we have also been talking to the Chinese government. Somewhat, I mean, this leaked out, right? We have been publicly talking about how we are talking to the Chinese government about they need to stop the work with Russia that they're going to be doing here. So there are a lot of reasons for, look, China is happy when there is chaos in the United States and Western Europe, but they don't like the democratic model. They don't really like the type of capitalist model to a certain extent, but it's much more the political side of it they don't like. But again, they don't need Russia causing problems for them economically in this kind of way. So I think it's a much more complicated story about China.
every war is fought on various levels, and this one, it seems to me, more than any that I can ever think of, has really been fought on the level of information, social media, and all of this kind of stuff. And so I guess I just wonder what you're thinking about. I mean, that's obviously become, it seems to me, almost as important as the weapons. And I guess my bigger question is, will it ever penetrate Russia? I mean, I think part of the reason that you alluded to earlier why many of the people of Russia, you know, the older people and the folks who rely on state media, is that they don't know. And will the slow trickle of the truth make it into Russia? Or, and it just seems to me that this is playing a really, really big piece. Somebody from there that I was seeing the other day was saying this is the most documented war in progress in human history. I mean, we see it every day, bombings and this kind of stuff in a way that we'd never seen before. So
two pieces to that question. One is the war itself, and you're right, this is, the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people have been very good at this. And I don't know if anyone saw President Zelensky's address to Congress today, but in the middle of it, they showed a video that was an incredibly powerful video that included, and if you haven't seen it, you should see it, that included these images of sort of Ukraine before and Ukraine after in the same setting of after being attacked and things, right? They did this very well. He himself has been very good about reaching his own people still in different ways, but also reaching the West. He's doing interviews on TV all over the place, right? He gets the information side of this. But the other piece of that, you're right, is it's ordinary people holding up a phone and recording things. I mean, you'll see a lot of these videos, and it's like it's going like this, and it's because somebody's holding a phone taking the video. There's no cameraman there, a camera person there from a Western media source. That image of the woman, there's a video of the woman giving the sunflowers, trying to give the sunflower seeds to the Russian soldiers. That was somebody just holding a phone, I think, taking that image. So, or the video. So yes, it's being well documented, and that is a problem for Russia because it doesn't like to do the things that it does out in the open in this way. Your second question, or second part of the question about Russia is trickier. The answer is yes, things are trickling in. It really matters where you live and how old you are, about what information you have about what's going on. So the younger people in Russia have a much better idea than older people. People in a few big cities have a really good idea. When there had been early protests against the war, people were kind of obsessing about the numbers of protesters. I thought that was far less important than the statistic that there were protests in over 50 different Russian cities on the same day. That's important. But again, it's still small numbers of people that maybe are getting that information. But little things are happening, and they build up and they add up over time. Many of you may have seen we call this a photo bomb when we do it, right? But the correspondent that held up the sign on live state TV basically had said no war, and then it basically laid out in Russian, this channel is lying to you about what's going on. Don't believe us on this station. We are lying about this war. So that was seen. They then took down that feed, and when they went back up, everything was blurred out. If you tried to go see it again, you couldn't see it, right? So they tried to kind of fix it, but there were people that saw that all over the country. So now they're having to kind of talk about that a little bit. The other thing that's really important is one of the other things that's happening is Russian soldiers are texting and calling their parents back in Russia, telling them what's going on. And in a few instances, which the Ukrainians have recorded and are using in a kind of propaganda way, about parents who are thrilled that this is going on and thrilled that their sons just described that they were looting houses and taking things and all that, right? Most of the conversations are not that. The parents are saying, what are you talking about? You're not in a shooting war in Ukraine. What are you talking about? You're north of Kiev. Nobody's in troops north of Kiev. They're all, they have no idea. But again, they either believe state TV or they believe their kid at that point. And so that's the kind of thing where now that's out. And so now they talk to friends. And I mean, it's slow, but that trickle can add up. The bigger issue is, again, whether there's a break within the elite somewhere at the top where somebody just says, we're going to tell the truth for a while, and does it in a way that's related to something about putting up pressure on Putin, something like that, where you can get the word out more. Other than that, again, it's going to be a situation still where a lot of the people in Russia don't know. And that's why we can't say they're supporting Putin, they're supporting the war. It's like they're supporting a version of something that's not reality. And it's not fair to say they're supporting the war because they're not seeing that, they're not hearing that. So it's this technology piece is a really important part. And I know we're kind of at time, right? We need to.
Yeah, I did. Do you see a way that this war could stop, being that Putin doesn't want to lose face? And then
So the question is there a way for the war to stop, given that Putin does not want to lose face here? In the short to medium term, I don't see that happening. I absolutely don't see it happening if Putin is still in charge. So that's and again, be a little careful about hoping for him to be overthrown, because again, the unknown is a little scary still for me in what comes after it, but the odds at least would be it may involve overthrowing him so they could in fact withdraw from Ukraine. So that's possible. And one of the things, I'll just end on because we need some kind of happy thought here, right? When you study these kinds of regimes, so I mentioned before, the circle tightens around him in terms of who's he leaning on for information, who does he trust. The information gets worse and worse. There's all sorts of things that are going on. The other institutions other than him get weaker. The Duma, with the parliament, the lower house of the parliament that has had genuine policy discussions at times, has become a rubber stamp for him. It's not really a very good functioning institution at this point. So the way that I explained this to my students at one point was I said, think of, there's like a dome and you're up on a hill and you're looking down at this dome. And it looks really solid and really strong, right? Because you see this dome. And then this bird flies and lands on it and the whole thing goes like that. And the reason is you can't see what's underneath the dome. You don't know what's holding it up underneath it. And one of the things about these kinds of political systems historically is they look really strong and really able to control things until they can't. And Ceausescu was a populist cult of personality communist leader in Romania. He went from giving a speech before a big crowd that he expected to be adoring him and they started yelling at him and he was very confused, to 3 days later he was dead. He's removed to a mock show trial in '89 and killed him. That these leaders, when they go, sometimes it can go very quickly for someone like Putin. And the problem is, again, he's probably aware of enough of that kind of history to know that. That's why he's getting very concerned and paranoid. So I can't see a good route with him in power of this ending easily. I hope I'm wrong, right? There's always hope of something that said it. It's why we hold negotiations like this. One side says something and the other side, oh, that's interesting. We didn't know that before, and then that leads to something. You never know. That's why you have talks. But with him in power, I don't see the thing that he can pitch to the Russian people and to himself as a win. He could try to do something and then control the message that they never were really in Ukraine or something like that, right? But that's not going to work. That won't hold up. So it's hard to picture a good outcome as long as he's still calling the shots. Sorry, that wasn't happy at the end. Anyway, him being ousted is maybe one thought we can think about, but again, we need to still be a little careful about that. So.
Well, thank you so much. For those of you who still have questions, Professor Barrington is willing to stay after, so feel free to come up. But let us now just focus. I saw a lot of themes from Lent in his talk. First, fasting. What are we going to have to give up to focus on these higher ideals? Almsgiving, being prepared to share our wealth with those in need. I can recommend Catholic Relief Services if you're looking for an outlet now. And prayer. Right? We can pray. As people of faith, we turn to God and ask for his help and his intervention. Pope Francis has asked us to plead with God, no more war, and asked us to do the Our Father for the people of Ukraine and asking for an end to the war. So in that vein, I'm just going to ask you to join me in praying the Our Father. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Your Father, Son, Spirit. Amen. Thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you to all of you who joined us online.